All right, guys, thank you for taking the time to sit down and review for your test. That's dedication, that's responsibility, and that is what giving 110% looks like. So kudos to you if you sit down to review with the video. I'm going to walk you through the early republic in this one. Excuse me. I'm going to apologize now for the audio. I'm doing this at the house, and the room I'm in is a little bit echoey, and so please bear with it. And so also, if you hear a dog barking, it's my little weenie dog named Snickers. But we've already had a revolution. We have fought for our independence. We have gotten rid of the tyranny of King George III. We've set up this system of government, one of the best governments ever in the history of the world. And before we leave this idea of what the Constitution looks like and how the Constitution works, I want to go back and add one more thing to it. The people, the men who wrote the Constitution, they knew that they wouldn't be able to think of every single situation that would ever come up in the future of the country. They knew that there would be times when the people would need to change things, would need to add some rules to the Constitution, maybe need to take something out. And so they wrote into the Constitution a method for actually amending it. They gave you two different ways to go about changing the Constitution if it needed to be changed. And it's a two-step process. The first step is the proposal, and then the second step is the ratification. And going with this idea of twos, there are two ways to propose an amendment, and there are two ways to ratify an amendment. Okay, so going with the proposal, and you can see in this graphic on the screen, a constitutional amendment can be proposed in one of two ways. The first type is by 2/3 of the members of both the House and the Senate. Okay, so if 2/3 of all of these men and women say, you know what, this is the amendment we want to make, and we like it, we're moving forward with it, we approve it, let's put it out there. One of the more recent amendments to the Constitution was changing the voting age to 18. 2/3 of both the House and the Senate said, you know what, we like this, this is why we like it, let's put it out there. All right, and so once you have that number, that 2/3, it has to be ratified. And the ratification simply means that the states, that the country is approving this proposal. The only way it's ever been done is by 3/4 of the state legislators. And so that means once it's been proposed, the states get together and they say, do we like this? The state of Texas gets together and says, do we like this proposal? Do we like the voting age changed to 18? Do we like this? They talk to the people of the state, and then they vote. And if 3/4 of the states vote yes, then that change to the Constitution takes place. That is the only way we've ever had amendments to the Constitution, is by going through 2/3 of the Congress and then 3/4 of the state legislators. However, there is a second way that you can amend the Constitution. It's never been used before, but it is a completely legal, it is a completely viable option to use. And in fact, if you pay attention to politics, there's a lot of people trying to use this state convention route. So basically, in order to propose it, you have what's called a convention of the states. That means 2/3 of the states are present at this convention. And that's kind of where it gets a little bit tricky, because we've never actually had this convention of the states. We don't know exactly what this convention of states would look like, but you have 2/3 of the states present, 2/3 of the states say, you know what, we like this amendment. We want to change the voting age to 18 years old. Done, period. Let's put it out there for ratification. And then, of course, you can ratify it as well by having 3/4 of the states giving their approval at this convention of the states. Like I said, this convention of states has never been used before. Will it be used? Who knows? But the way that it's typically done is going through 2/3 of the Congress and then 3/4 of the states. Now, this is designed to be an incredibly difficult, and it's designed to be a long process. The reason being is because we don't want to have knee-jerk emotional reactions. Let's say we have a situation arise, and we get very emotional over the scenario, and we say, we've got to change the Constitution. Well, if you go back to the beginning of the year, we said emotions don't get a vote. And so it's designed to slow the process down so that emotions can die down, and we can make a good, clear, logical decision over whether or not this amendment is good or whether or not this amendment is bad. So there you go, amending the Constitution. Definitely keep that in the back of your head as you move into your test on Tuesday. Okay, so we have had a revolution, we have this constitution, and now we actually have to live our lives. Now we actually have to move forward underneath this freedom and underneath this government that we fought for. First president underneath the Constitution is obviously George Washington. Two big things you need to take away from Washington's presidency, and they're both contained in his farewell address. Number one is isolationism. George Washington said, you know what, we need to isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. We need to worry about ourselves before we start worrying about the world. We are a brand new country. We need to get our act together. We need to grow up a little bit. Let's not get involved in other countries. Let's just simply focus on ourselves. This is isolationism. The second aspect of his legacy in the presidency, if you will, is that he disliked political parties. In his farewell address that was printed in newspapers across the country, he said, do not let yourselves divide into two parties. Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And we can see the wisdom in that today. If you ever watch any type of news programs where they have people from two different political parties, they always end in them arguing back and forth. And George Washington knew human nature. He knew what people would be like. That doesn't mean you can't disagree, but let's not label ourselves as Democrat. Let's not label ourselves as Republican. Let's not label ourselves in his world. It would have been, don't label ourselves as Federalists. Don't label ourselves as anti-Federalist. Let's find what we work together on and focus on that. Both of these things people have over time ignored. The Monroe Doctrine obviously destroys the idea of focusing only on ourselves. We know we have political parties today. However, we can see the wisdom that George Washington had in these two ideas from the farewell address. Second president is John Adams. John Adams, if you remember from the last video, definitely tended to be more on the Federalist side of things. We have this XYZ affair and this Alien and Sedition Acts very closely tied together. They're the big things that happened underneath his presidency. XYZ affair was with France. John Adams sent some men to France to work out a deal between the two countries, and they were basically asked to take a bribe. There was lots of bribery going on, and it basically offended John Adams. It offended the men he sent over, and they're like, we're not doing this kind of thing. This whole bribery thing may work here in Europe, but we're not doing it here. And so the deal kind of falls under. It doesn't work very well. We come back. We have the Alien and Sedition Acts, and this scared a whole lot of people, because when you look at what the Alien and Sedition Acts did, and that they came about as a result of this failure of the XYZ agreements and such, but it did two main things to the citizens of the U.S. Number one, it made it very difficult to become a citizen. If you weren't already one, if you had immigrated from another country, you typically had to wait, I want to say it was 5 years. Before you could become a citizen. Well, with the Alien and Sedition Acts, it changed that from 5 years to 14 years. Made it very difficult. It also took the people who were speaking bad against the government, and it either, if they weren't a citizen, it sent them away, it deported them, and if they were a citizen, it jailed them. Basically, this scared the people, because this is the tyranny that the American citizens were trying to get away from underneath King George. And oh my gosh, now all of a sudden we have it underneath here, John Adams here in the U.S. The thing with this, though, is that it was done for a very good reason. You did have lots of dissent, ruining people's attitudes in the public. But that doesn't mean you round people up and throw them in jail. It doesn't mean you deport them out of the country. So John Adams, as great of a man and president that he was, kind of messed up here with the Alien and Sedition Acts. Thomas Jefferson is the third one, and Thomas Jefferson was on the opposite end of the spectrum than John Adams, and that's kind of how politics go. If you look at politics today, you have a Republican president and then a Democrat president, and then we go back to a Republican and then back to a Democrat. It's kind of like a pendulum that just swings back and forth, back and forth. If John Adams was way on one side, people got tired of the Alien and Sedition Act, so they elected someone that was completely different, like Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was very much a anti-federalist. He did not like the government having lots of power. If you remember from the other video, he was very much a strict interpretation of the Constitution. He believed if the Constitution says it, I'll do it. If the Constitution does not say it, then I won't do it. Which is through tons of people that Thomas Jefferson completed the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. It doubled the U.S., which is going to play into the whole idea of manifest destiny and westward expansion later on. But the Louisiana Purchase, the ability to buy land like this, was never actually specifically mentioned in the Constitution. And so Thomas Jefferson just kind of jumping on this deal surprised a lot of people because it was kind of against what he normally stood for. But Louisiana Purchase was done. It was completed and purchased in the year 1803. You need to remember that year, 1803, Louisiana Purchase. Okay, it doubled the size of the U.S. And then, of course, Thomas Jefferson did deal with the Embargo Acts of 1807. Basically, it was an attempt to build the economy in the U.S., and we'll get to the economy in the U.S. in the War of 1812. James Madison is the president during the War of 1812. And I'm about to give you a slide in a minute with the War of 1812, but real briefly, the war didn't do a whole lot except for in the minds of people. It created this respect that the world had for the U.S. It's not a little bitty baby anymore. They kind of take care of themselves, and it sparked the Industrial Revolution, which we'll get to. All right, James Monroe, big thing you need to know is the Monroe Doctrine. And several of you guys did some excellent presentations over the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe Doctrine basically said two things. It said, all right, we are the United States, and we are the ultimate power here in the West. So if there is a situation with North America, the United States is going to deal with it. If there's a situation with South America, the United States is going to deal with it. Europe, you can't mess with the Americas. Europe, you cannot mess with North America. Europe, you cannot mess with South America. You just can't come over here. And if you don't come over here, guess what? We'll kind of do the reverse. We won't involve ourselves with the European business. You deal with your stuff over there. We'll deal with our stuff over here, the Monroe Doctrine. Now, think back to George Washington and his isolationist idea. Kind of goes against this idea of isolationism when James Monroe says we are going to handle everything here in the West. So agree, disagree, but this is the Monroe Doctrine that James Monroe established. And then the next president is Andrew Jackson. He is a man of the people. He is the one who had tons and tons of people at the White House during his inauguration party, if you will. You have stories of people tracking in mud on their boots. They're just ruining furniture in the White House. And they ended up, they got a big old keg of beer, put it out on the White House lawn and said, hey, everybody inside, there's beer outside. And that's how they managed to get all the people that were ruining the White House out of the White House. Of course, you know, they slammed the doors, lock it after them. But keg of beer, there they went. So Andrew Jackson sets himself up as a man of the people, kind of helping the common man, helping the farmer, helping the man who just has mud on his boots, wants to go grab a beer. That's the persona that Andrew Jackson was trying to give out to people. One of the biggest things that happened underneath Andrew Jackson's presidency was the Trail of Tears, which is a direct contradiction, if you will, of the Worcester v. Georgia Supreme Court case. Basically, you have a whole bunch of Cherokee Indians in Georgia. They end up going to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says that, you know what, you cannot make these people leave their land. Andrew Jackson says, I don't really care what you say, I'm going to do what I want to do. And so he forced all of those Indians out of Georgia into the West, and that's where we get the Trail of Tears. Okay, so let's jump back to the War of 1812. There's several things that fall underneath the causes. You have England blockading the U.S., which means England is positioning its ships outside of the U.S. borders in the water, not letting U.S. ships go in or out, which kind of closes the U.S. off from getting supplies from other countries. You have England impressing U.S. soldiers. Impressment simply means I am taking you into my army. So it took men from United States boats. It took them and said, you know what, I don't care if you're in the U.S., you are now going to fight for the British Navy. So we have England blockading the U.S. We have England kidnapping soldiers and making them join the British Army or the British Navy. And you also have the English encouraging the Indians to kind of fight against the U.S. From the West. So you have the Indians in the West attacking the U.S. and you have the British in the east, in the Atlantic Ocean there. And so it just completely encloses the U.S. and the U.S. has to do something about it. We do have a war, and a couple of things that resulted from the war. Number one, it strengthened our economy. With the blockade that the British had on our borders, we basically had to depend on ourselves. We couldn't depend on other countries to send us supplies. We had to do it ourselves, and that strengthened the economy. It also kickstarted the Industrial Revolution, because if you remember the video or one of the pictures I showed you, the redneck swimming pool, you have this idea of inventions being that they're born out of necessity. It's the mother of necessity. And when we need it, we're going to figure out a way to solve the problem. And so because the United States was blockaded, they figured out a way to solve their need for supplies. They made it themselves. And it also created a sense of nationalism. They created a lot of pride in the U.S. Because it's like, yeah, we are this new country. We're not a baby anymore. We can hold our own. We can protect ourselves. So they have the rise of patriotism after the War of 1812. You also have Francis Scott Key writing the Star Spangled Banner. If you remember, you had the piles of bodies holding the flag up. And you have to think back, why were they so willing to die for their country? Why were they so willing to die for a flag? Because they knew what it represented. They knew that the freedom that they had just won during the American Revolution was being attacked again. And they knew that if they lost here at the War of 1812, then that freedom would go away. They would lose that freedom. And they knew that once they lost the freedom, they would maybe never get it back again. All right, also here in this early section of U.S. history, we need to be aware of some Supreme Court cases. Chief Justice John Marshall, he was the Chief Justice in charge of several of these, and he was incredibly influential. Perhaps one of the most influential court cases was Marbury v. Madison, which basically established the idea of judicial review. This happens the same year Thomas Jefferson purchases the Louisiana Territory in 1803. Judicial review, if you remember, is basically the idea that I'm going to decide whether or not the laws that the legislator makes are constitutional. And so if you make a law that says all puppy dogs have to eat food at 9 o'clock in the morning only, I'm going to, as the Supreme Court, I'm going to look at that law and I'm going to decide if that is a constitutional law or not. Does this line up with what the Constitution says? And the great irony of all of this is that that's actually an illegal thing for the Supreme Court to be doing. So it's the idea of I am breaking the law to keep the law, which doesn't work very well, but it sets precedents. And we've talked about this word precedents. It's an example that people after you follow. And judicial review, precedents has been made. That's how the Supreme Court functions. Another one is Worcester v. Georgia. This is the one underneath Andrew Jackson with the Indians in Georgia. This is a picture of Mr. Worcester, and we know what happens there. The presidency, Andrew Jackson ignores what the court says and says, you know what, I don't care that you, Supreme Court, said that the Indians can stay. I want them gone, so he ships them out west. We have McCulloch versus Maryland, which is where we have Maryland trying to tax the national government. The national government's putting the national bank in Maryland because it's not Maryland Bank. Maryland wants to tax it. And the Supreme Court basically says, sorry, we're on top. We're the parent here. You are the child state. You have to do what we tell you to do. You can't tax me. It'd be kind of like you telling your parents, you have to give me an allowance. And the parent says, you know what, if I don't want to give you an allowance, I'm not going to give you an allowance. That's the idea we have going on here with McCulloch versus Maryland. We have Gibbons v. Ogden, where the national government controls interstate business. Inter, if you know that prefix, it means between. So business between states, interstate business, the national government controls. And so you can see that John Marshall in the Supreme Court is establishing precedents in favor of the Federalist. All of these Supreme Court cases are giving the federal government a lot of power, which makes the anti-federalists very upset with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is creating precedents that the government, the national government, has lots and lots of power, and the states have little power, which is this age-old argument, who gets to make the call? Is it the national government or is it the state government? So Gibbons v. Ogden continues with this idea. Dred Scott versus Sanford doesn't really come to the Civil War, but it's the only other court case you need to know, and it basically said that slaves are property. And with that, that is all I have for our early Republic section. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll be there on Monday if you need to talk in person. And thanks for watching, and you're going to do well on your test.